Some seek adventure and laughter, expecting only joy, but sometimes they leave with a nightmare. This was the fate of a group of thrill seekers at a circus, where excitement turned to horror. Had the trainer chosen puppets, the night might have ended differently. Instead, he made the fatal mistake of using a live grizzly bear. What followed was a lesson in regret, one he would never forget. It was the evening of March 7th, 2025, as the circus tent buzzed with energy. The crowd, bundled in coats against the Russian winter, filled the red and gold seats, excitement mounting as the main act prepared to take the stage. Spotlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the center ring. The announcer's voice boomed, introducing the star attraction, Thor, the mighty Russian grizzly. Thor had been the circus's main spectacle for years. Nearly 1,000 pounds of raw power, he moved with a grace that defied his size. He had performed countless times, balancing on pedestals, standing upright, rolling oversized balls. His trainer, Dmitri, had spent years molding him into a controlled performer, a bond built on obedience. Tonight, Thor was flawless. He rose on his hind legs, paws stretched high, black eyes catching the glare of the lights. The crowd erupted as he stepped onto his pedestal, his massive frame balanced with ease. Dmitri stood beside him, guiding him with practiced gestures, confident and relaxed. Then, something changed. A crackling speaker, a camera flash, or perhaps nothing at all, just something primal stirring deep inside the bear's mind. His body tensed, the controlled movements faltered, his breathing grew labored. Black eyes darted, nostrils flaring. The audience kept cheering, oblivious. Dmitri sensed it too late, and at that moment, Thor lashed out. A massive paw swung with terrifying speed, catching Dmitri's arm in a crushing grip. A sharp crack echoed through the air. Dmitri staggered, pain contorting his face, but Thor did not let go. The bear pulled, dragging his trainer closer. This was no act, and the cheers turned to screams immediately. Thor's instincts had taken over now. Whatever years of training he had endured, whatever bond he had shared with Dmitri, had all unraveled in seconds. He stood taller, teeth bared, his powerful jaws clamping down on Dmitri's shoulder. The man struggled, twisting against the bear's crushing strength, but the difference between human and beast had never been clearer. Blood stained the sawdust-covered floor, a dark pool spreading beneath them. The other trainers rushed in, wielding long metal poles, desperate to intervene. They shouted and waved their arms, trying to divert Thor's attention. One struck him hard across the side, but it only seemed to fuel his rage. With another violent motion, he lifted Dmitri clear off the ground, shaking him like a rag doll before slamming him back down. The sound of bones snapping echoed in the stunned silence that had overtaken the crowd. Panic spread like wildfire. Parents scooped up their children, shoving through the narrow aisles toward the exits. People tripped over fallen chairs, screams blending into a chaotic blur of noise. Some remained frozen, unable to tear their eyes away from the horror unfolding in the ring. Thor, wild now, turned on the approaching trainers. One tried to jab him with a pole, aiming for his ribs, but the bear swatted it away with terrifying ease, the metal clattering uselessly to the ground. Another trainer reached for the emergency fire extinguisher, discharging a blast of white spray in a desperate attempt to disorient him. The sudden burst of cold air and noise made Thor recoil for a brief moment, but it did little to quell the rage that had taken hold. Dmitri was no longer moving. His body lay twisted, his arm still caught in Thor's grip, his chest rising and falling in faint, uneven motions. His uniform, once pristine, was torn and slick with blood. The audience had all but evacuated now, the sound of sirens wailing in the distance as someone had called emergency services. Finally, the moment of hesitation from the extinguisher allowed a trainer to act. A dart gun, loaded with a high dose of tranquilizer, was raised and fired. The dart buried itself in Thor's thick hide, but he barely reacted. His adrenaline was too high, his fury too overwhelming. Another shot followed, then another. The bear staggered, his growls turning into deep, guttural breaths. His body swayed, his massive limbs shaking as the sedative fought against the storm raging in his system. After what felt like an eternity, Thor collapsed. His weight hit the ground with a dull, final thud, his chest rising and falling heavily. His fur, matted with blood, not all of it his own, shone under the harsh stage lights. Dmitri was still motionless beside him. When the medics arrived, there was little they could do. Dmitri had succumbed to his injuries before they could even get him onto the stretcher. The tent, once filled with laughter and applause, now stood eerily silent, save for the occasional sobs of those who had witnessed the tragedy. The news spread quickly. Within hours, videos of the attack flooded the internet, capturing the exact moment when Thor turned from performer to predator. The public outcry was immediate. Protests erupted across Russia, fueled by activists who had long condemned the use of wild animals in circuses. The footage became a grim reminder of what many had warned for years, that no amount of training could strip an apex predator of its true nature. Authorities launched an investigation, examining whether safety protocols had been ignored and whether Thor had shown signs of stress before the attack. Reports surfaced that he had been displaying agitation in the days leading up to the show, pacing restlessly in his enclosure and refusing to eat. Some claimed he had been pushed too far, forced to perform under conditions that had finally shattered whatever restraint had kept him in check. Debates flared in the media. Should circuses be allowed to use wild animals? Was the tragedy the result of human arrogance, the belief that nature could be tamed with enough discipline? Or was it simply an accident, a moment of unpredictability that no amount of preparation could have prevented? In the end, the circus was shut down indefinitely. Thor, sedated and transported to a wildlife reserve, remained under heavy watch. His fate was uncertain. Some argued he should be euthanized, a risk too great to be left alive. Others demanded he be given a chance to live out his days in a sanctuary, far from the ring that had once made him a spectacle. But for those who had been there that night, no debate or resolution could erase what they had seen. The roar of the crowd turning into screams, the blur of fur and blood, the undeniable, terrifying realization that no matter how much humans tried to control it, nature could never truly be caged. The Martinez family had been looking forward to this trip for months. Luis and Maria, both lovers of the outdoors, had planned a week-long camping adventure in the wilderness of Wyoming with their 3 children, 14-year-old Javier, 12-year-old Sofia, and 7-year-old Mateo. They had arrived at the park 3 days earlier, setting up their RV in a secluded spot near a dense forest, away from the more crowded campgrounds. Luis had insisted that they experience nature more intimately, away from the noise of other campers. Maria had agreed, though she made sure they followed every safety guideline, especially regarding food storage. The October air had a crisp bite to it, and the towering pines swayed in the evening breeze. As dusk settled, the family prepared for dinner, the rich scent of grilled meat and warm stew filling the air. The flickering glow of the lanterns cast long shadows on the RV's aluminum siding, their laughter and conversation blending with the distant sounds of the wilderness. A full day of hiking had left them exhausted but content. They were utterly unaware that something had already caught their scent. A grizzly bear, large, powerful, and dangerously hungry, had been wandering the area for days. The season had reached the point where food was becoming scarce, and with winter approaching, the bear was desperate to build enough fat to survive hibernation. It had caught the aroma of cooking meat earlier in the evening, and now, as the sky darkened, it prowled closer, nostrils flaring and muscles tense beneath its thick fur. The bear had already learned that human camps could mean easy meals. It had raided a few unsecured sites before, overturning coolers and tearing through tents, but tonight, its hunger was deeper and its patience thinner. The family remained unaware of the predator lurking in the shadows. Inside the RV, they settled in for the night. The children were getting ready for bed while Maria cleaned up, making sure all the food was properly stored. Luis sat at the small fold-out table, flipping through a park guide and already planning the next day's hike. Outside, the bear had drawn closer, circling the RV and sniffing along the base where the last traces of food clung to the air. Then, without warning, the grizzly made its move. A deafening crash shattered the night as the bear lunged at the side of the RV, its massive weight slamming into the thin metal. The impact sent the entire vehicle rocking. Inside, chaos erupted. Maria spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. Luis shot up from his seat, his mind scrambling to process what had just happened. Another crash. The bear, driven by hunger and adrenaline, tore into the RV's flimsy side panel, its claws raking through metal and fiberglass like paper. A hole formed, jagged and splintered, revealing the gleaming eyes of the beast as it snarled. The sound was primal, a deep guttural growl that sent ice through Maria's veins. Luis moved fast, shoving the children toward the back of the RV, trying to create as much distance between them and the bear as possible. The RV wasn't built to withstand this kind of attack. The bear struck again, its head forcing its way through the widening hole. Snapping jaws, hot breath steaming in the cold air. It was inside. Panic surged through the confined space. Maria grabbed whatever she could, throwing pots and heavy objects within reach, but they barely fazed the animal. The bear clawed forward, its massive frame pushing through, knocking over furniture and sending objects flying. In the chaos, Luis charged, trying to shield his family, to do anything to stop the beast. The bear met him with pure force, swiping a colossal paw across his chest. Luis staggered back, a deep gash opening across his torso, blood already soaking his shirt. He didn't even have time to react before the bear struck again, this time full force, knocking him to the floor. The children screamed. Maria tried to pull them further back, searching desperately for something, anything, that could stop this nightmare. Luis struggled, his breath coming in sharp gasps, his body battered. The bear was relentless, its hunger overriding any hesitation. Claws dug into flesh, and the scent of blood thickened in the air. Then the bear turned, shifting its focus. Javier, the eldest, had made the mistake of moving too suddenly in the cramped space. The beast lunged, its teeth sinking into the boy's arm and dragging him forward. His body slammed against the cabinets as he fought, his small hands trying to push the massive jaws away. Maria moved without thinking, grabbing a fire extinguisher and slamming it against the bear's back. It barely flinched. Sofia tried to pull Javier away, but the bear's grip was like a vice. Then, as if sensing another easy target, it twisted toward Mateo. The youngest had backed himself into a corner, his tiny hands clutching his sleeping bag, frozen in pure terror. The bear's eyes locked onto him. Something snapped in Maria. Her hands fumbled through the storage compartment near the back, grasping for the emergency supplies. Her fingers closed around the cold metal of the flare gun. She had never fired one before, but there was no time for hesitation. The bear loomed over Mateo now, its mouth inches from his small frame. Maria raised the flare gun and pulled the trigger. A sharp explosion of red light filled the RV, the flare shooting toward the ceiling before ricocheting off the walls. The bright flash and sudden heat sent the bear reeling. It roared, its senses overwhelmed by the burst of fire and smoke. Staggering backward, it turned sharply, retreating the way it had come, clawing its way back through the hole it had made. Then it was gone. For a moment, there was only the sound of ragged breathing, of bodies trembling, and of Maria clutching the flare gun so tightly her hands ached. Luis lay motionless in the center of the RV, blood pooling beneath him. Javier cradled his injured arm, his face pale, while Sofia shook beside him. Mateo sobbed quietly, his small body curled up where he had been moments from death. Maria crawled to Luis, her hands pressing against his wounds, willing him to stay, to hold on. But his eyes, already glassy, were slipping away. The bear had done too much damage. His breathing came in shallow gasps, his body still. She called his name, but the man she had spent her life with, the father of her children, was gone before help could ever reach them. The Rangers arrived not long after, their radios crackling and their rifles ready. They tracked the bear and found it wandering not far from the site, its mouth still stained with blood. The decision was immediate. One shot rang through the trees, and then there was silence. News of the attack spread quickly. Park officials reinforced their warnings, urging campers to stay within designated areas, to take food storage more seriously, and to respect the dangers that lurked in the wild. Safety measures were reviewed and debated, but for Maria, for Javier, Sofia, and Mateo, none of it mattered. The air was crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth as 4 teenagers, Ben, Matt, Jake, and Ryan, set up their campsite deep in Michigan's forest. It was October 12th, and the trees had begun to shed their autumn colors, leaving a thick carpet of red and gold beneath their feet. The boys had planned this trip for weeks, eager to escape the routines of school and home life. The remoteness of the forest thrilled them, the vastness stretching beyond anything they had ever experienced. They had hiked miles to find this secluded spot, settling beside a quiet creek that wound through the woods like a silver ribbon. The first night had been perfect. They cooked over a crackling fire, their laughter echoing through the trees. Afterward, they lay beneath a sky awash with stars, the kind of darkness only true wilderness could provide. The sounds of distant owls and rustling leaves lulled them to sleep, their tents nestled against the towering trees like tiny islands in a sea of black. By the second night, a sense of ease had settled over them. They had spent the day exploring the trails, tracking deer prints in the soft soil, and skipping rocks across the creek's surface. As dusk fell, they lit their fire again, roasting hot dogs and marshmallows. The scent of charred food and melted sugar drifted through the air, mingling with the sharp tang of wood smoke. Unbeknownst to them, another presence had caught the scent as well. Somewhere beyond the firelight, a black bear began to stir. It had been moving through the woods, scavenging for the last remnants of summer's abundance before the long winter set in. The scent of human food was unmistakable, a temptation too strong to ignore. Slowly, the bear made its way toward the camp, its massive paws soundless against the fallen leaves. It watched from the shadows, its eyes reflecting the flickering glow of the fire. The boys first noticed it when a rustling sound came from the underbrush just beyond the tree line. At first, they assumed it was nothing, just the wind moving through the forest, perhaps a raccoon sniffing around for scraps. But then, a dark shape emerged. At the edge of the fire's glow stood the bear, its hulking form stark against the trees. For a moment, it simply watched them, its nose twitching in the air. Then it took a slow step forward. The boys reacted instinctively, jumping to their feet. Fear sharpened their movements as they grabbed whatever they could, pots, sticks, even the metal lid of their cooler, banging them together in a desperate attempt to frighten it away. The noise shattered the quiet night, echoing through the trees. But the bear did not retreat. It hesitated only briefly before stepping closer. Their fire crackled, casting wild shadows over its dark fur. It was close enough now that they could see its wet nose and the way its breath fogged in the cool night air. It wasn't bluffing. It wasn't curious anymore. It wanted food. And then, in an instant, it charged. Ben was the closest. He barely had time to react before the bear's weight crashed into him. The impact was brutal, knocking the wind from his lungs as he hit the ground. The force sent a shockwave through his body, pain blooming instantly as claws raked across his chest. The world blurred into a frenzy of movement, flashes of teeth, the sharp sting of tearing skin, the distant sound of his friend's screams. The others lunged into action. Jake grabbed a burning log from the fire, swinging it wildly toward the bear's face. Sparks flew, the heat singeing the air between them. Matt threw a heavy rock, striking the bear's side with a dull thud. Ryan grabbed a hunting knife, desperation fueling his grip as he rushed forward. But the bear was relentless. It roared, the deep guttural sound reverberating through the night, shaking the trees. Ben struggled beneath the bear's weight, his hands pushing weakly against the coarse fur. The pain was excruciating, claws sinking deep, teeth clamping down with crushing force. The bear was in a frenzy now, its instincts fully unleashed. Blood soaked into the dirt beneath him, dark and warm. His vision blurred, his strength fading. Another rock struck the bear's flank, then another. The firelight flickered wildly as his friends fought, their terror fueling them. The bear let out a sharp huff, momentarily distracted by the onslaught. It lifted its massive head, eyes flashing in the firelight. Then, just as quickly as it had attacked, it recoiled. With a final snarl, it turned and loped into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. The silence that followed was deafening. Ben lay still, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His friends rushed to his side, their hands pressing against the deep wounds, trying to stop the bleeding. His skin was ghostly pale, his eyes unfocused. The metallic scent of blood filled the air, mixing with the lingering smoke from the fire. Jake fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly that he nearly dropped it. The 911 operator's voice was a distant murmur against the pounding in their ears. Time stretched and warped, every second dragging. They whispered frantic reassurances, their voices trembling. But Ben was slipping away. His fingers twitched weakly, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. His chest rose once, then again, then stilled. The realization hit like a physical blow. The weight of it pressed down on them, suffocating in its finality. Tears burned in their eyes, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The fire crackled beside them, oblivious to the horror that had just unfolded. When the paramedics arrived, the camp was a scene of devastation. The forest was still, as if mourning with them. The bear was long gone, vanished into the depths of the wilderness, leaving only its destruction behind. The news spread quickly, rippling through the community. Officials issued warnings, urging campers to be more vigilant, to store their food properly, and to remember that in the wild, they were not the dominant force. In the weeks that followed, the boys struggled to process what had happened. The memories clung to them like shadows. Ben's laughter by the fire, the weight of his body beneath the bear, and most especially, the way life had faded from his eyes. The wind cut through the pines with a low, mournful howl as the search team moved cautiously along the narrow trail. It was November, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Officer Greg took the lead, while his partner, Officer Liz, followed closely behind. The others fanned out, their flashlights piercing the gloom as they scanned for any trace of the missing hiker. The park northwest of Wyoming was vast and unforgiving, its jagged peaks looming against the darkening sky. The distress call had come in just before sunset, a garbled message from a lone hiker who had vanished 2 days ago. His last known coordinates placed him somewhere near this remote section of the park, a place rarely disturbed by human presence. The team moved in silence, their breath visible in the frigid air. Every step felt heavier as the trail grew narrower, winding through dense undergrowth that clawed at their uniforms. The radios crackled occasionally, distant voices confirming that other search teams were sweeping adjacent areas. But this part of the wilderness was particularly isolated, with no easy exits and no quick way back to safety. A strange stillness settled over the landscape, different from the usual quiet of the forest. The nocturnal sounds of the wild, chirping insects, rustling branches, seemed to vanish. It was a silence that felt wrong, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. Then it happened. A deep, guttural huff broke the silence, followed by the sharp snap of a branch. Instinct sent a cold jolt through Greg's spine. He barely had time to register the movement before the massive shape exploded from the undergrowth. A grizzly, its hulking body illuminated by the beams of their flashlights, its fur rippling with raw muscle, eyes dark and wild. The bear charged. Greg had no chance to react before the sheer force of the animal sent him crashing onto his back. Pain shot through his ribs as the air was driven from his lungs. Liz's hand shot to her bear spray, a split-second reaction born from training and instinct. She raised the canister, her finger pressing down, but the bear was too fast. With a single bone-crushing swipe, it knocked the spray from her grip, sending it spinning into the darkness. The animal turned on her next, and she barely had time to raise her arms before its weight slammed into her. The impact sent her sprawling, pain exploding through her side as she landed hard against a fallen log. Her vision blurred for a moment, but she forced herself to focus. Greg was still down, his body twisted in the dirt, the bear towering over him. He was struggling, trying to reach his firearm, but the grizzly was relentless. Claws tore into him again, a terrible sound of shredding fabric and flesh filling the night. The others had begun to fire, sharp, deafening cracks cutting through the chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness, the sound of gunfire echoing through the trees. But the grizzly was unfazed. If anything, the gunfire only seemed to enrage it further. Liz fought against the pain and forced herself to move. She reached for her own sidearm, her hands slick with sweat, trembling as she aimed. The bear reared up, a terrifying silhouette against the night sky, and she pulled the trigger. The first shot struck its shoulder, the second grazing its side. The grizzly roared, a guttural, blood-chilling sound, but it did not fall. Instead, it turned back to Greg, jaws snapping, fangs flashing in the dim light. More shots rang out. A well-aimed round hit the bear's ribcage, another striking its hind leg. It staggered now, the pain finally slowing it. Blood matted its thick fur. But still, it refused to retreat. Greg had stopped moving. His body lay still beneath the massive weight of the animal. Liz tried to drag herself toward him, but her legs felt leaden, her strength fading. The others were closing in now, their rifles raised, their voices lost in the chaos. Another shot rang out, a final desperate attempt to drive the bear back. At last, the grizzly shuddered, its body convulsing before it let out one last guttural breath. It turned, its massive frame weaving unsteadily as it lumbered back into the trees. The forest swallowed it whole, the darkness reclaiming the beast. Silence fell once more. The stench of blood and gunpowder lingered in the air, mixing with the cold bite of the wind. Liz lay motionless, her body racked with pain, her breath shallow. The others rushed forward, but she could already see the truth in their faces. Greg was gone. The next hours blurred together. Helicopters arrived, cutting through the night sky. Medics worked quickly, their voices low and urgent as they stabilized Liz and checked the others for injuries. The body of the grizzly was never recovered. Despite a follow-up search, it had vanished into the wilderness, leaving only blood-stained earth in its wake. News of the attack spread fast. The footage from the officers' body cameras painted a harrowing picture, a brutal encounter that left little room for error. Wildlife experts were called in, analyzing the bear's behavior and debating what had provoked it. Some claimed it had been starving, driven to desperation by the encroaching cold. Others believed it had simply been defending its territory, reacting instinctively to the sudden intrusion. In the aftermath, the police department launched a full investigation, not just into the attack, but into the protocols that had failed to prepare them for it. The conversation spread far beyond Wyoming, igniting debates on law enforcement's role in wilderness operations. Some called for mandatory bear deterrent training, while others advocated for heavier firepower. But the question remained, could anything have truly prevented what had happened that night? Liz spent weeks recovering, The scars would never fully fade, reminders of how close she had come to death. The loss of Greg weighed heavier than anything. He had been a seasoned officer, a friend, someone who had trusted his training and instincts. But none of it had been enough against the force of nature that had claimed him. The air was cool and crisp as Sally and Greg made their way through the rugged beauty of Kodiak Island. The trail, uneven and damp, wound through a landscape untouched by time. Dense forests gave way to sweeping coastal cliffs where the Pacific crashed against jagged rock. It was wild, unfiltered, and exactly what they had hoped for. They had spent months planning this trip, eager for an adventure that would pull them away from the humdrum of daily life. Sally had been particularly excited about Kodiak's wildlife, its bald eagles, its endless salmon runs, and of course, its legendary bears. Greg, ever the pragmatist, had researched the dangers carefully, ensuring they had bear spray, a flare gun, and the knowledge to stay safe. But no amount of preparation could override the randomness of nature. As they walked deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of civilization disappeared entirely. The only noises were the rhythmic crunch of their boots, the distant call of a raven, and the bubbling of unseen streams cutting through the terrain. Occasionally, Greg would pause to check his map, confirming their route as they neared a secluded stream, rumored to be one of the best spots to capture Kodiak's untamed beauty. When they arrived, the setting was perfect. The stream twisted through a clearing, its crystal waters swirling over smooth gray stones. It was here, amid the peace of nature, that they made their fatal mistake. Sally pulled out her camera while Greg scouted a better vantage point. Lost in the moment, neither noticed the enormous shape in the distance, a Kodiak bear, its hulking mass partially obscured by overhanging branches. It had been feeding on fish, its fur damp from the water. The bear had not been expecting company, and in an instant, everything changed. The bear lifted its head, its dark eyes locking onto them, its muscles tensed. It did not hesitate. A deep, guttural huff filled the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy paws pounding against the earth. Greg reacted first, his instincts sharp despite the sudden terror gripping his chest. He reached for the flare gun strapped to his belt, fumbling as adrenaline surged through him. Sally froze, her body momentarily betraying her, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The bear closed the distance with terrifying speed, covering ground in powerful strides. Greg fired. The bright flare streaked toward the massive predator, illuminating its furious charge. For a fraction of a second it hesitated, shaking its head, but it did not stop. Then, it was upon him. The first swipe hit Greg with bone-shattering force, sending him sprawling backward. His scream was lost in the chaos. The bear did not relent. Claws tore through fabric, then flesh, as Greg struggled beneath its weight. He fought back, thrashing, but the disparity between man and beast was insurmountable. The bear's jaws clamped onto his shoulder, crushing bone as it shook him violently. Blood soaked the earth. Sally's paralysis shattered, and instinct took over. She ran, her feet pounded against the uneven ground, slipping on damp moss, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She dared not look back, but the sounds followed her. The wet, brutal sounds of Greg's destruction, the bear's snarling breath, the sickening crack of breaking bone. She pushed forward, lungs burning, heart hammering, but the bear was not done. It had finished with Greg, and now it came for her. The ground betrayed her. A hidden root caught her foot, sending her sprawling face first into the dirt. Pain shot up her arms as she scrambled to rise, but it was too late. A massive weight slammed into her back, driving the air from her lungs. Claws raked down her side, igniting a firestorm of agony. The bear's breath was hot against her neck, the scent of blood thick in her nostrils. She twisted, kicking wildly, but the bear pinned her down. A crushing bite to her leg sent fresh waves of pain surging through her, her vision flashing white. The world blurred, the trees, the sky, the rushing water, all of it fading into a haze of agony and desperation. For a moment, she thought she heard something distant, a bird's cry, the rush of water, but the bear's growl drowned it all. Another brutal swipe tore across her chest, her body convulsing with shock, the strength drained from her limbs. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the struggle ended. The bear released her, its massive head lifting, its breath heaving. Perhaps it sensed that its work was done. Perhaps it was simply satisfied. With one final exhale, it turned and lumbered back toward the stream, where the scent of fresh salmon still lingered. The silence that followed was absolute. Hours later, a pair of park rangers found them. The distress call had come from another group of hikers who had stumbled upon the scene. Blood smeared across the ground, the shredded remains of backpacks, the air thick with the scent of death. Greg was already gone, his body mauled beyond recognition. Sally clung to life, but just barely. The rangers worked quickly, calling for medevac, but deep down they knew the human body could only endure so much. By the time the helicopter arrived, Sally was gone. News of the attack spread rapidly, sending shockwaves through the outdoor community. Kodiak Island had always been wild, but this was different. Two seasoned hikers, prepared and cautious, torn apart in a place meant to be beautiful. Experts weighed in, debating whether human activity was encroaching too far into bear territory or if more regulations were needed. Officials acted quickly, setting new guidelines for hiking in remote areas. Certain zones were closed indefinitely, and more bear-free activity zones were proposed. Days later, the bear was found. Wildlife officials tracked it to a dense thicket near the river, where it had returned to feed. They made no hesitation. A single shot rang out, and the bear collapsed. Its death did not bring justice. It did not erase the terror, the loss, or the gruesome reality of nature's indifference. But it did close the chapter on a tragedy that would never be forgotten. The wind howled across the Wyoming backcountry, carrying a sharp bite that cut through even the thickest layers of insulation. Luke had spent years navigating these remote, snow-packed trails, the roar of his snowmobile a familiar companion against the silence of winter. The snow had fallen heavily the night before, leaving a fresh, powdery surface that glistened under the pale afternoon sun. Luke moved effortlessly across the landscape, the hum of his engine echoing through the vast emptiness. He followed a ridge that overlooked a frozen river, watching as wisps of snow curled into the air with each gust of wind. Eventually, he came to a stop in a wide clearing, cutting the engine and letting the stillness settle around him. He pulled off his gloves, flexing his fingers against the cold, and inhaled deeply. He barely had time to register the sound of something heavy moving through the snow just beyond the tree line. Before his brain could fully process the danger, the Grizzly emerged. It was massive, its shaggy coat thick with winter's weight, patches of frost clinging to its fur. Its breath came in ragged puffs, steaming in the cold air. A bear in the dead of winter was rare but not impossible. This one was desperate. Perhaps food had grown scarce, forcing it to roam farther than usual, its instincts overriding the natural lull of hibernation. Whatever had brought it here didn't matter. What mattered was that it had locked onto him. Luke moved fast, adrenaline surging. He reached for the snowmobile's ignition, fingers trembling as he yanked at the pull cord. The engine coughed but didn't turn over. The bear charged, a blur of muscle and fur. It covered ground with terrifying speed, snow exploding beneath its powerful limbs. Luke barely had time to react before it was on him. The impact sent him sprawling backward, the world a chaotic blur of white, black, and brown. His body slammed into the snow, the cold biting through his layers, but there was no time to feel it. The bear's weight crushed down on him, pinning him beneath its bulk. Claws raked across his leg, slicing through fabric and flesh with sickening ease. The pain was instant, sharp and electric, radiating up through his hip. His instincts screamed, but he didn't have time to focus on survival, only on action. His hand found a chunk of ice, and he drove it into the bear's thick fur, aiming for anything soft. It barely registered. The bear roared, hot breath washing over his face, the stench of raw meat and decay filling his nostrils. Another swipe, this time across his abdomen. The pain was blinding. Warm blood seeped into the snow beneath him, staining it deep crimson. His body screamed for relief, but his mind refused to give in. He kicked, twisted, and did anything to gain leverage. His boot connected with the bear's side, not enough to hurt it, but enough to throw off its balance for a split second. It was all he needed. With every ounce of strength, Luke lunged for the snowmobile. The bear followed, massive paws digging into the snow as it lunged after him. He grabbed the handlebars, using the machine as a barrier. When the bear swiped, he shoved the snowmobile hard, the weight of it forcing the bear to stumble. A breath, a single moment where the bear hesitated. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Luke didn't waste it. He shoved again, harder this time. The machine slid, knocking the bear off balance and forcing it to backpedal. Blood loss made his vision tunnel, but he didn't stop. He pushed, kicked, and fought like hell. The bear reared back, frustrated, nostrils flaring as it huffed, its breath misting in the cold. Its dark eyes bore into him, considering. Another attack could end this. It could end him, but something shifted. Maybe it sensed he wasn't worth the effort. Maybe it felt the wounds it had already inflicted were enough. Or maybe hunger had driven it too far, exhaustion overtaking its rage. Whatever the reason, the bear took a step back, then another. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it turned. It lumbered toward the trees, disappearing into the thick shadows of the pines. Luke collapsed against the snowmobile, his breath ragged, his body screaming in pain. His leg was a mangled mess, his abdomen torn open, and the blood loss was already making him dizzy. The cold that had once been a crisp, welcome presence now felt unbearable, like death creeping in at the edges of his consciousness. He knew he had to move. With shaking hands, he dug into his gear, pulling out a first aid kit. He worked fast, pressing gauze against his wounds, gritting his teeth against the agony. His vision blurred, but he forced himself to stay conscious. He couldn't afford to black out. The snowmobile was still functional, battered but functional. He climbed on, wincing as pain flared through his body and yanked at the ignition. This time it roared to life. The vibration rattled through his battered body, but he didn't care. He turned toward the nearest trailhead, knowing that every second counted. The ride back was a blur of agony and determination. Every bump sent fresh waves of pain through his system. Every gust of wind threatened to pull him into unconsciousness, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. By the time he reached a ranger station, his body was barely holding on. Medics swarmed him, voices distant, hands pressing against his wounds, stabilizing him. He let go then, his mind drifting, knowing that, for now, he was safe. The attack sent shockwaves through the snowmobiling community. Grizzlies weren't supposed to be active in deep winter, but climate change, food shortages, and shifting habitats had altered nature's rhythm. Experts debated what could be done. More awareness, better tracking, and stricter precautions for winter riders venturing too far into the backcountry. Luke survived, but he would never forget. The scars on his body were permanent reminders that nature was unpredictable. The wilderness had nearly claimed him, and though he had escaped, he knew he had danced on the edge of something primal, and next time, he might not be so lucky.